Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is always PorkinsPolicyReview.com. Well, I am very excited about today's show and today's guest. And as a little sort of explainer, in anticipation of the 21st anniversary of the ending of the OJ Simpson trial, we're going to be doing a couple of different episodes about the trial, about the murder case and everything. And joining me to discuss this, or for this opening series, is my very good friend, Stephen Singular. Stephen, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me, Pierce.
Well, great, excellent, and I think all of my old-time listeners are very familiar with Stephen and his work. Stephen, of course, wrote the amazing book Legacy of Deception: An Investigation of Mark Fuhrman and Racism in the LAPD. And Stephen is a frequent guest back when this was a podcast. And we'll link up to all of the previous episodes to explainers and how Stephen was involved in the case and the book that he wrote. Lots of information there. But Stephen, you are new to a lot of the listeners here at AFR. So briefly, why don't you just kind of tell the listeners a little bit about who Stephen Singular is and your initial connection to the OJ Simpson trial?
Well, I live in Denver, and I've been a journalist since the mid-'70s and an author since about the mid-'80s. I've written 22 nonfiction books, many of them about high-profile crimes, the Simpson case being one of those examples. In the first book I wrote was called Talk to Death, which became somewhat the basis for the Oliver Stone film from 1989 called Talk Radio. Some of the people have probably seen that movie. It was rather loosely based on my book, Talk to Death, which was about the neo-Nazi assassination of Alan Berg, a talk show host here in Denver, who was gunned down in his driveway in June of 1984 because he was outspoken on the radio. He was liberal, a liberal voice, and he was Jewish. And the people who killed him came out of a group called the Order that was committed to sort of a white power revolution in America in the mid-1980s. They committed 240 crimes and were all prosecuted by the federal government or pled guilty. So that's sort of the baseline of where my book writing career started, and it's very relevant to what happened 10 years later in the O.J. Simpson case. I had, when researching the Berg book, met numerous people across the United States who were involved in investigating far-right groups, neo-Nazis, etc. Some of those were in California. There was a stronghold down by Los Angeles. And so 10 years after Berg was killed, in August of 1994, about 6 weeks into the O.J. Simpson case, I was contacted by somebody in law enforcement in Los Angeles whom I had met earlier when doing research on the Berg book. So I was asked if I wanted to investigate what really amounts to a different kind of domestic terrorism. The Berg case was clearly that kind of domestic terrorism, killing people, robbing banks, setting off bombs, etc. So I asked the person who contacted me, well, what do you mean? And I was told, well, there are different kinds of domestic terrorism, from shooting people or blowing up things. And I didn't really know what any of that meant at the time, and I couldn't see how it had any real connection to me or anything I'd ever done. And like most people, I had watched Simpson take his infamous Bronco ride on June 17th, 1994, and concluded that he looked quite guilty in that case. So I had no plans to get involved in it in any way, shape, or form. But I was told that, again, there are other types of terrorism from what I had written about earlier, and if I were willing to get involved in the Simpson case, I might really have a great education for myself and my way of thinking and all of that. So the talk went on, and I said, well, tell me what you're talking about. And I was essentially given 4 pieces of information. This was August 2nd, 1994, way before the trial began, months. And I was told that if I were to approach the defense team in this case, they would probably be willing to listen to me. And I told my source, well, why don't you approach them, or why don't you go to the prosecutors and tell them about this evidence? And I was told in no uncertain terms that the prosecutors would not pay any attention to it. Their minds were made up, and it wasn't going to go anywhere, but there was a chance that the defense would listen. So I said, all right, I'll try this, and made a couple of phone calls to California, and that got me absolutely nowhere. Finally wrote up on a piece of paper the 4 things that I had been told. I'd been told other things, but there were 4 primary things at the beginning, and faxed it off to Johnny Cochran's office. And it took a while to get through, but once one of the lawyers got his hands on the actual fax, his name was Carl Douglas, he was second in command to Cochran. He called me 15 minutes later and said, where did you get this information? And I said, well, I'm not going to talk about this unless I'm face-to-face with you in Los Angeles. And that made him very, very angry, and he said, we'll never do that, blah, blah, blah. He said, we'll never do that a lot to me. That's something that's important to understand at the very start of this story. There was tremendous resistance, not only on the prosecution side, as the source said, but also on the defense's side. So I persisted and said, no meeting, no information. And 4 or 5 days later, I was sitting in Los Angeles in Robert Shapiro's office. You will probably all remember the lawyers in the case. Robert Shapiro was the first one, and then Johnny Cochran, and Carl Douglas was like third in line. And I was meeting with Carl Douglas and his private investigator, Bill Pavlik, and a couple of other people. And the 4 pieces of information that I conveyed at the time were that Mark Fuhrman had some sort of relationship with Nicole Simpson that went well beyond what the public knew about. And I'm not saying now or then that they were lovers, but there was some connection that went much deeper than Fuhrman having gone over to the Simpsons property once in the mid-'80s because there was an altercation at the house between OJ and Nicole. When I conveyed that information to the private investigator, who was a former LAPD cop, he told me I was wrong. I was told about a piece of broken stick that was critical to the case that had never surfaced up till this point, that was retrieved from Simpson's property, and I was told that the stick did not exist. I was told about a blue plastic evidence bag that homicide detectives carry with them when they go to crime scenes, and it had also been retrieved from Simpson's estate and was in evidence, and they said there's no stick and there's no bag. But by far the most critical piece of information I was given, and this is complicated stuff, so I need to explain it in some detail, that when a criminal suspect is taken into custody, as O.J. Simpson was on the afternoon of June 13th, 1994, one day, really about 13 hours after these crimes, he flew back from Chicago. He was taken into custody. He was questioned at great length by 2 detectives at that time. They took his blood, which is normal, and they put it in a vial with a purple cap on it, which is normal, and they drew 8 milliliters, according to the man who actually drew the blood and charted all of this. All that is very important information. Simpson was then released, and what I was told was that at the bottom of a purple cap vial of this nature is a substance called EDTA, which is an anticoagulant, which is there so that blood will not harden or become useless over a period of time. It needs to stay fresh. It needs to be preserved. And this compound does that. So you can do DNA testing on down the road or other testing. So what I was told was if you could get the defense to test certain critical pieces of blood evidence in this case, it would show that those samples contained this substance, which means that the blood could not come out of Simpson's body on the night of the crime, but had to come out of this vial, as I said, was taken from him the following day, which means that the blood, through a scientific test, would show that it had been planted. The blood evidence in this case, as I think most people realize, was the critical evidence. We saw the gloves did not fit his hand. We saw that the little cap they had did not fit his head. There are no witnesses in this case. There's no retrieved murder weapon, etc. So the blood evidence really is the critical physical evidentiary piece of the case. So I told the defense, I believe it was August 8th of 1994, get your hands on these blood samples. Any part of the case, blood at the Bundy crime scene, blood found at OJ's, and test that blood for EDTA. And if you can find it in there, then you've clearly shown that evidence against the defendant has been manufactured and the case is going to fall apart. They told me that I was dead wrong, that what I was suggesting to them was a physical impossibility. Could never have happened because once the blood was drawn, it was into the purple cap vial. The vial is sealed. The vial is taken to the evidence room in L.A., which is called at Parker Center, which is where evidence is stored. And if the seal had been broken or somebody had come in and stolen it and done what I was suggesting, that would have become known. That would have been so obvious. So basically, they patted me on the back and said, have a nice flight back to Denver, and that was that. And I was a little taken aback because I believed that I was in a position of trying to convey potentially very useful information to them. But they were pretty much a brick wall. However, at the end of our meeting, Carl Douglas, the lawyer, did take me aside and say, get me some more information. So the door wasn't totally closed. I went back to Denver. I talked to the source, my source again, received more information, and kind of let this simmer in L.A. Well, the first thing they did was go to the evidence in the case and find that they had completely overlooked a broken piece of stick that was found at Simpson's because nobody could really understood what it was, and a blue plastic evidence bag that had been tossed over the fence from the side of Simpson's property, actually where Cato Kalin was spent his time in that bungalow, and where Furman claimed to find a bloody glove incriminated Simpson a few hours after the crime. There's a chain-link fence running right next to the walkway where the glove was found, and on the other side of the fence there was a blue plastic bag, an evidence bag the police carry with them. So when the defense learned that these two things were in fact real, the door began to open a little bit wider, and Carl Douglas and I started talking more and more, and I said, Carl, test the blood. And it was a very complex thing for them to do, to get their hands on the evidence and get the tests run, and nobody had ever run a test like this or really heard of anything like this, so there was, again, a lot of resistance. So what I had initially told them about the stick in the bag was that everybody sort of knows the Furman story, that he came to the crime scene in the middle of the night, and then at about 6 a.m., he took 3 other detectives over to Simpson's property, got rid of them, stashed them in the house as quickly as he could to talk to other people, and went off by himself and found this glove a few minutes later. The story that I was told and the story that I was checking out was that Furman did indeed come to the crime scene in the middle of the night. He had a prior contact and knowledge of the Simpson-Nicole marriage, and he had some personal connection with her, as I said earlier, and that he talked another officer into going over to Simpson's property at about 3 in the morning, not 3 hours later, 6 a.m., but at 3 a.m., because he was absolutely convinced that they would find evidence over there. So they went over there, they looked around, they did not find any evidence incriminating O.J. Simpson, and they got into a very loud argument about it because that's not what police officers are supposed to do when they're watching a crime scene or looking at a crime scene. The argument, for those who followed the case closely, there was a woman who lived adjacent to the Simpson property named Rosa Lopez. She worked for that family. The following morning, Mark Furman was canvassing the neighborhood, as police do in the aftermath of a homicide, or when looking for suspects. And he actually went to Rosa Lopez's door, and he asked her if she saw or heard anything, and she told him that she heard two men arguing very loudly right next door at 3 a.m. Furman said, well, I'll come back to you on that. Of course, he never did. She would later testify to all this at the trial, that there was, in fact, people on Simpson's property at 3 a.m., and they were arguing. And the story that I was told was that Furman then went back to Simpson's property, went into the alley behind the property, broke a piece of stick off of the fence, came back into the crime scene. It's very dark. It's in the middle of the night. And as he would subsequently testify in the preliminary hearing, this is a critical piece of information, he saw them lying on the ground. The them is a reference to two gloves, not one, but two gloves. I was told that he picked up one of the gloves with the stick, put it in the blue plastic bag, secreted it on his person, and waited for senior detectives to come to the crime scene. Those two detectives then arrived, Detective Van Natter, Detective Lang, and along with Lang and Van Natter and another officer and Furman, then they went over to Simpson's property. That's the narrative that everybody in this story knows, that it's at 5:30 in the morning or around then. They go back to Simpson's. Furman jumps the fence. He gets inside the property. He lets in the other officers. He deposits them inside the house. He goes out, and lo and behold, he finds this bloody glove sitting on the ground. So that also was information that I conveyed to the defense team. That was the connection with the stick and the bag. So once they found those items in evidence in the what's called the murder book in cases like this, where you have all the evidence in shiny, the color photographs, which I saw in this case later on, they began to listen a little bit more to what I was saying. However, it was difficult for them to do the most critical thing in this case, which was to test the blood. So I'll leave out some of the story, but by October they were listening to me a lot more. This started in early August. By mid-October, and they asked me to come to L.A. and to try to get someone in the crime lab to talk to them about what they believed had been done with Simpson's blood sample, his blood vial. And I agreed to do that, but I was not successful. The people in the crime lab, this is the most prominent case ever being covered by media everywhere. They were very afraid of talking to somebody like me, and I ultimately could not achieve what I was being asked to do. So I went back to Cochran and Douglas, and this is all laid out in the new book, the new updated version of the book, Legacy of Deception, on Kindle, Amazon, for those who want to read the details. And I went back, and Douglas was a really hard guy to deal with. He played very hard with me, and he was very upset because I couldn't do what he wanted and started a lot of name-calling and all of that. And I went back to Denver and just thought, I've worked for 3 months for these people. Nobody's paying me. They're incredibly difficult to deal with. I'm just going to be a journalist now and write up a proposal and see if someone's interested in sort of pursuing this story that's been going on for 3 months, and we'll see how it plays out as the trial goes on once it starts. Because I wanted to see how this information was going to play out in the course of the trial, how they were going to use it, and what was substantiated and what wouldn't be substantiated. So I wrote a proposal, and I sent it off to a publisher, and I called Carl Douglas, and he was absolutely infuriated with me and said, "I'll never speak to you again," and threw down the phone. What happened was that my proposal, which basically lays out what I'm talking about here, all of these things, had been handed over to the district attorney's office in Los Angeles and had been given to the defense and had been distributed to certain people in the media. When I had submitted the proposal, I had said on the front cover, strictly confidential, do not show to anyone else, but that did not hold up. Information throughout the Simpson case got leaked, and this got leaked. And I was, of course, totally stunned. And so what seemed like, at the time, the worst possible outcome for me, because I could no longer talk to the defense, etc., would eventually become the best thing that could have happened for me from my point of view. And I'll explain that as I go on. So what all of that means is that in early November of 1994, which is 3 full months before the trial will begin, the defense has this information, especially about the preservative in the blood, and the prosecution has this information about how a glove was moved according to what I had been told, and about how blood had been planted, the critical things in this case. So they all knew that. It was in front of all of them. So when the trial started in late January, February came along, and one of the prosecuting attorneys named Rockne Harmon stood up in front of Judge Ito and said, there has been this outrageous allegation that blood was planted in this case and that it has this anticoagulant in it. And it's suggested that there's a way to test this blood and find out if that's true or false. And the prosecution would like to call in the FBI and have them run this test. And so the judge agreed to that process. When Rockne Harmon wrote to the FBI, and this is a direct quote, he wrote a letter to the FBI saying, will you come in and test the blood to refute the possibility that this happened? Think about this for a minute. He wrote, will you come in and refute the possibility? He did not write, will you come in and test the blood and find out what's in there so we can get to the bottom of this? Because this is what in the law, in legal terms, is called Brady material. In other words, if that stuff is in the blood, it absolutely establishes that blood was planted, and that's exculpatory evidence. And the process stops right there. Now, if you don't want to take my word for what I'm saying, that's fine. Go to Christopher Darden's book, New York Times best-selling book. Darden and Marcia Clark were the lead prosecutors in the case. Go to page 174 to 178 of In Contempt, his book. And there are 5 pages devoted to this episode. The media, of course, did not pay any attention to this because it went against everything they believed. But if you don't want my account, take his. He writes, he got his hands on the book proposal. He was worried about it because he uses the same phrases I'm using. This is Brady material. This could derail the trial. And he looked at what the defense was doing here, and he writes about it in some depth. He also says at the end of the 5 pages that he wondered how much O.J. Simpson had actually paid for a defense that came from a crime writer in Colorado. That would be... So we know that O.J. Simpson, whatever money he had, $2 million, $5 million, $10 million, was going into his defense system. Mm. So
let me just jump in.
I didn't get
quickly.
any money. Let's be clear about that. Okay. Go ahead, Pierce.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say, if this is new to anyone, then they definitely should check out the new edition of your book, because you get into, I know this is a lot of information for people, but they can definitely find all of this in your new book, and also in the several, I think we've done 3 episodes together on all of this.
Right.
We get into a lot more detail, but just sort of, adding on to all of this, again, you were just mentioning the fact that, that this was, not covered in the media. And I don't think you're ever mentioned in the FX show or in the ESPN documentary series, but this is the case. Everything that you were told all came out during the case. There was an evidence bag that was clearly visible in some of the crime scene photos. There was a stick that was also visible. There was EDTA in the blood. You mentioned earlier that there were 8 milliliters of blood taken from OJ, and there was 1.5 milliliters missing.
Right.
It did come out in the criminal trial that Van Adder was wandering around for several unaccounted hours with a vial of OJ Simpson's blood, and then it came out in the civil trial that he also had a vial of Nicole's blood and also Ronald's blood.
Right.
So these are the 3 principles in the whole in this case. So
right.
No, did you want to say something, Stephen?
No, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just gonna, I guess that sort of brings me, I guess to my, the one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you is because, as I mentioned before, this is the October 3rd, which is next Monday, is going to be the 21st anniversary of the not guilty verdict in this trial, and yet we're still constantly being fed the same old story and theories and basically lies about all of this. And it's funny. I mean, I think in just that half hour that you were talking, Stephen, I think that, anyone out there listening who had already formed their opinion, suddenly, you're presenting them with real facts. And the issue, I think the major issue with all of this is that the people saying that OJ is guilty, they have no facts. It's all emotion. You talk a lot about that in Legacy of Deception. The emotion of these talking heads is right. What was sort of forced down everyone's throats, not the actual facts of the case.
I think the important thing for people to understand here is that one of the first things I said in this interview is, like 90 million other people watching the Bronco ride, I leap to the assumptions that, the guy's got to be guilty. That's number one. Number two, I was given this information on early August of 94. I did not in any way, shape, or form accept it as being the truth. I got involved as a journalist saying to myself, if this can get into the legal system, and be proven or disproven one way or the other, but if it could be proven, then it would change the whole paradigm of what this case is really about. And my job was to check it out as a journalist, not to take sides, not to go on the radio and say so-and-so is guilty, so-and-so isn't guilty, but to see if this information could be verified through our legal system. So let's back up a little bit and go to those 4 major things. While the trial was unfolding, the LAPD did an internal affairs investigation of Furman. And not only did people come forward in the summer of 1994, about the same time I got involved, and said, the guy's not trustworthy. There are police officers saying he places swastikas in the lockers of a man who's married to a Jewish woman, a fellow police officer. He has Nazi paraphernalia. He has violently, viscerally racist ideas and possibly behaviors. This is people within LA's legal system, not journalists, not talk show people, going to the authorities and saying, you need to pay attention to this. You can't believe what this guy says. Back this up a little bit further. Why was I involved in the case? Because the first book I wrote was about neo-Nazis who wanted to get rid of African Americans and Jews, among other people. And so what was becoming apparent through the course of this investigation was that there was a direct connection in terms of the mindset between the people I wrote about who killed Alan Berg and people like Mark Furman, who were going around telling civilians in L.A., I'd like to round up all the African Americans and burn them to death. That's a real direct connection. That explains why I was involved. That explains why I was given information and tried to get it into the system. So other officers came forward and said Furman bragged at barbecues about seeing Nicole Simpson's, quote, breast job, meaning he was with her off duty. He had some connection with her that went well beyond one visit to Simpson's property in the mid-'80s, and verifying precisely what I had been told in early August of 1994. The stick and the bag were in evidence. The FBI came into the case at the prosecution's request. They tested the blood, and they found multiple examples of EDTA in the critical blood evidence. And as Pierce said, Van Adder had not only OJ's blood, but Ron and Nicole's. So the four principal things that I was told about the case checked out through the course of the trial. And when my participation became known, right before the defense was going to put on its case, which was about May of 1995, I was contacted by every major media organization in the United States, from top to bottom, New York Times, Chicago papers, LA Times, CBS, NBC, ABC, the cable world that was emerging at that time. And I told every single one of these people the story I'm telling today. This is 21 plus years ago. And I said, watch how this plays out in the course of the trial. Watch the blood preservative issue. It's going to be critical. Nobody.
And it all was.
And it all was, and it all checked out, every single thing we're talking about, and nobody ever called me back. So if you happen to be listening to this broadcast, thanks to Pierce, ask yourself why you don't know this story. Ask yourself how the FBI could have been called into the most visible criminal case in American history to run a scientific test and showed that the blood evidence against Simpson had been planted. Scientifically, they show it. And this has never been reported on in major media. It has never come out in any of these documentaries or other shows, docudramas that came out over the winter. It is not in the most prominent books that have been written about this case by people like Jeffrey Toobin and Lawrence Schiller. It is totally, utterly, and completely ignored. Now, you could say to yourself, okay, that happened 21 years ago. That's too bad, so what? What I'm suggesting here and now is that the reason that I was encouraged to get involved in this case was to show what had happened here and to connect it to the larger pattern of police misconduct that sometimes does occur, especially against minority people. Now, how relevant is that to what's going on in the United States today? How relevant is it to these police shootings or the shootings of police or to manufactured evidence or to people lying under oath or to the ongoing violent problems connected to policing minority communities? This is the greatest example of that we have in our history, and it was established through the legal system and through scientific processes that these things went on in this case. And the absolute, utter failure of the American media to report on this, I suggest to you, is having consequences that are unfolding today. And they are incredibly negative, corrosive, very discouraging consequences. We all are hurt by either police shooting minorities or vice versa. And until we're willing to take an honest look at this situation, we're stuck.
No, I was talking about that on a previous episode I had on with Brian Heiss, who's an OJ researcher himself, and he actually made a really great documentary. I'll send you a copy of it, Stephen, all about Furman and the Furman tapes, and he made it sort of in anticipation of the anniversary of the Furman tapes being released. But when we were talking, we were sort of, I kind of brought up the idea of this almost being kind of like a litmus test for how far can the police go. Because you look at Furman as an individual, and you look at his connections to not only to neo-Nazi groups operating within the LAPD, but this group Men Against Women, which is this sort of clandestine group within the LAPD, which basically sought to intimidate female officers. You look at just the mere fact that this guy is now walking completely scot-free, having pled the fifth on planting evidence on all sorts of things. He's an admitted racist, no matter what he says, even if he goes on Oprah. And he's now commenting on police shootings and the response of different political groups. And it does, I think, for a lot of officers, they look at Furman, they look at what happened, they look at the whole case, they look at, can you imagine if you were arrested for murder and you find out that the detectives are walking around with vials of your blood and, 1.5 milliliters is missing? In your own mind, that would never fly. Yet we see this happen throughout the whole OJ trial. And I think it did create this climate where we now see the police, now they're killing people on camera and getting away with it. Right. They don't even have to go through the trouble of this whole intricate trial and having all, various, lawyers and DAs and, forensic people all kind of covering up for several, issues that took place very early on in the hours after the murder. So I think the correlation, the connection is right there in front of you. And again, the impact that this has had on all of us is very powerful. And, something that I learned from, talking with you and reading your book and kind of looking into this is this, it's funny. Anytime I was recently talking with a good friend of mine, and she had just finished watching the ESPN documentary series. And all of my friends, because they know that I'm into OJ, they're, oh well, you have to watch that because it's gonna change your mind. And I basically, you just did, in half an hour, laid out to her all of these things that she said, well, they never even touched that in the documentary. And the documentary is very much about emotion. It's about showing OJ as this evil, horrible, abusive person, and he was in some respects. I don't think he was a nice person. He did physically abuse Nicole at least one reported time. And the more you look into it and you start seeing all the drug connections, yeah, these were not nice people. But that doesn't dismiss the evidence. And I guess, Stephen, my question to you is, it's almost as if people want to hear the same stories. They want to hear about this evil man. They want to hear, they want all these things reinforced. And I guess my question to you is, why do you think that is? Is that sort of something that's just become part of our nature and our psyche?
Well, it's much more comforting. When you look at a very large social reality of any kind, a social issue or problem, if you can blame everything on one person, it's not only much more comforting, it gets you off the hook. There's no more basic story in my book, Legacy of Deception, than my own journey to understanding that, guess what, I didn't know everything about this by watching a film clip on television, that I didn't know the truth by listening to Geraldo Rivera say over and over and over again, Simpson's guilty, that we have become, a people that are very comfortable living that way and being spoon-fed very simple things that mask very complex realities. There is no more complex reality in our country than the racial dynamics and the criminal justice system connections to that. I mean, it is incredibly complicated. I'm not sitting here on the radio saying, the police are bad. I'm not, or taking any position like that. The Simpson case was an opportunity to look behind the mask of this case and try to figure out what really happened. And at every single opportunity the media was given a chance to do that, they not only didn't do it, they just absolutely refused to even consider it. I was called by a CNN producer about 3 months ago, about when Legacy of Deception went up on Amazon Kindle. And he said, we're going to do the untold stories of the OJ Simpson case. And I said, well, I've got one for you. And, the story we've just talked about for 40 minutes. And I laid it out for him, and he said, and what he said to me was almost knocked me over. He listened and he said, what do you want? And I didn't understand what he meant at first. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, what do you want? And what he meant was, how much money do you want to be paid to feed this to the American population? And I said, I don't want a nickel from you, man. I've been doing this for 22 years. I've been trying just to get people to open their minds a little bit to understand that not only what happened in this case is much more complicated than you've ever been told, but it's an ongoing reality in our society, the relations between the police and the minority community, the violence inherent in it, the problems. It's not going away. It's not going away until we develop some different way of looking at it and dealing with it. And it's a tragedy on all sides. Every time a minority person dies, every time a cop dies. And this guy's response to me was, how much money are you looking for? And I don't want to beat up on him or CNN or anybody else, but that's what you're dealing with. It was inconceivable to somebody who was looking for an untold story of the O.J. Simpson case that this story could be relevant to anything. And he shot me down as hard as he could. And the painful part of this, folks, is not that the truth didn't come out. The truth came out in the course of the trial. The truth came out that the gloves didn't fit Simpson's hand or the cap on his head. The truth came out that there were about 15 to 20 minutes on the clock for him to kill two people, drive across town, get rid of all of the evidence, take a shower, and get ready to go to Chicago. The truth came out
with no blood in his house.
When he got on a plane to Chicago, and people recognized him and began asking him to sign autographs. If the police story of this case is true, his hands had to be bleeding, there had to be bandages all over his hands, or he had to have cuts on his hands. And he was signing autographs on white pieces of paper, as usual, with people on the plane. They testified at the trial. Most people don't know that. The truth came out. You were kept from that because it's a difficult story to tell, and it's a more difficult story to sell. And they're interested in selling a product. That's well and good. This is not a product. This is our lives as Americans, as how we relate to one another, as to how we actually uphold the Constitution we all profess to believe in, that people do have rights. And if those rights get violated, and if they get violated intentionally by people who are conscious of what they're doing, those people should be prosecuted. Furman walked away from this. He moved to the same location where the neo-Nazis were who murdered Alan Berg at Sandpoint, Idaho, And he's still a commentator on Fox as recently as last week, talking about race relations in the United States. We haven't begun to come to grips with what happened in the Simpson trial and with what's still happening with us now. And all I say, give the book a chance, give this conversation a chance, because this is not going away. We're going to keep dealing with it until we develop a different mindset.
No, I mean that's always my my suggestion to people that are interested or that they talk to me about. And of course, they all, I'll have friends or people I work with, and they'll ask me, "Oh, well, then what happened?" And it takes a while to explain. Even in the condensed version that you've become comfortable in sort of laying out there, that takes at least a half an hour, and people don't even want to sit there and listen to that. They want, well, it was this person or that person, or,
right.
They want a little tiny, again, they want the talking head. You talk a lot in the book about the sort of rise of talking head cable opinion media. That's what they really want. And they want that with a sort of sexed up Hollywood glitz and glamour, and that, OJ, and again, they always sort of, they paint OJ as this sort of Jekyll and Hyde person. And I wanted to get your take on that quickly. Cause you had suggested to me an excellent book, which I always suggest also, after you read Legacy of Deception, you should check out Killing Time, which is by Donald Freed and Raymond Biggs. And they talk a lot about this concept that I think it's W.E. Du Bois coined it, called doubleness, as it relates to the black man. And the two versions of OJ are the crazed ex-lover who did this in a frenzied attack. Also, at the same time, he was a cold-blooded, calculating guy who was able to hide the murder weapon, hide all these other things, clean up all of the blood in his house, clean the blood off himself, somehow clean the blood out of the drain pipes. There was no blood found in his in the pipes in his house. Yet he's also this stupid idiot who dropped the gloves and dropped the cap, which didn't fit him. So, and I guess just to comment on that, Stephen, this sort of, again, this is this image of the big, scary black guy that has sort of permeated our society. And that, again, seems to be what all people want to hear. And I mean, what do you think of that, again, as this relates out to all of the sort of police crime we see? Because whenever a black guy is killed, he's always either a drug dealer, he started it with the cops, he had something, I mean, talk about that briefly, just that psyche, again, that image that has been created.
Well, it's an extremely complex and difficult question that you're asking. I mean, it goes back to Shakespeare and Othello, same type of story. I really think, again, from my point of view as a journalist writing about this, I never had a brief for OJ Simpson. I never felt that was what I was writing about, in terms of, I wanted to know, as I was told from the beginning, if there is a different type of domestic terrorism from bombing and shooting. And I was told that some of these ideas pervaded certain pockets of major metropolitan police systems. I didn't know that or believe it or necessarily accept it on any level. I was interested in getting at whether or not that was true. What many people also don't realize is that when all the things came out about Furman, that, he's putting a swastika here and there, he's talking about genocide against minorities, or gay people or other people, that the immediate thing was, well, that's a rogue cop. There's always a bad apple in the barrel, and boy, that's one. About 3 years after the Simpson trial ended, there was the biggest scandal in the LAPD system in decades, called the Rampart Scandal, and it was about officers who were engaging in patterns of violence, of selling drugs, of beating people senseless, shooting people, planting evidence, et cetera, et cetera. I wrote a book about it called The Uncivil War. If people are interested, they can look it up on the Internet, or the Rampart scandal. And it showed a pattern and an institutional acceptance up to that point of incredibly violent, destructive behavior by a police force. Again, that doesn't paint all the police in a negative light. That, to me, is the much larger issue here. I can't defend O.J. Simpson's behavior in his marriage or any of that. That's not my purpose or the right thing to do. If there's anything to draw from that, it's that somebody like him, who was probably the most prominent, black athlete in terms of acceptance by corporate America, his life can be destroyed in one instant. And people are absolutely willing to turn on him and believe that every horrible thing that they're saying he did is true. He was totally and completely vulnerable in a way that a white person in America might not have been. I'll tell you something that I got out of the ESPN documentary, and it was. At the end of that show, they show him hanging out with some really seedy people. There's no other way to put it. And I mean, here was OJ. Here was a man who traveled in white society probably better than almost any black athlete in American history. And married to a beautiful white woman. That was his whole world. All of his in-laws, were white, and they all admired him. And the entire world, and then he, I'm sure he thought in his own mind, if I go through the system and if I'm exonerated and if it shows this didn't do this, I can go back into that society. And he absolutely could not do it. And you saw his deterioration on that documentary, that he had slid down and down and down into hanging out with some not very good people. And I have no doubt that that's exactly what led him into doing the stupidest thing he's ever done, which is go to Las Vegas and try to get his stuff back and end up in jail probably for the rest of his life. So there's just such a dichotomy here between how white Americans see the world and black Americans see the world, and it was so exemplified by this case. And if you go below the surface of the case, I mean, I'm white, so it's hard for me to understand some of the racial dynamics on the other side. But if you go below the surface of this case and you understand what was really done here, and it was done intentionally to tear this guy down, it shows how vulnerable people in that community really are. And that's, it doesn't justify violence on either side of the fence, but it shows us something about why the attitudes are so, difficult and destructive. And I think we just, if we could talk honestly about the Simpson case, I think we would come a great distance to start maybe to be honest about this stuff and maybe even heal some of it. The divisions are worse now than they were then. I mean, that's the whole point of this, is that the divisions on both sides, the violence is greater, all of it. And it's because the truth has value. I mean, that's why I got into journalism. That's why you're doing what you're doing, and it sounds very simplistic, but it has a cleansing, positive value for society. That's why we had something like Watergate. We're not going to let presidents, even the President of the United States, break the law. We're going to hold somebody accountable. The truth comes out. It's a cleansing, healing, pro-society event. This is the opposite, and we're paying the price today in Charlotte, in Brooklyn, in Staten Island, all over the place. And the
Stephen,
we're
coming up on the break right now, but we'll continue in the second hour. I know, Stephen, you have to leave, so we'll try and keep it short. But we will be right back with more of Stephen Singular.
I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Did you know there are 3 million edible food plants on Earth, and none have the nutritional value of the hemp plant? HempUSA.org offers you hemp protein powder. It does not contain chemicals or THC, is non-GMO, and is 100% gluten-free. Hemp protein powder burns fat, builds muscle, contains 53% protein, and feeds the body the nutrients it needs. Call 888-910-4367 and see what our powder, seeds, and oil can do for you. Only at HempUSA.org. HempUSA.org introduces 3 brand new detox formulations of microplant powder. Brain Fuel for depression, bipolar disorders, and stress. Total Care, anti-cancer agent that cleans the liver and organs and increases memory. Rejuvenate, invigorates and heals the body, mind, and spirit. These products are your alternative to pharmaceuticals. Call 888-910-4367 and like us on Facebook. We ship worldwide. Only at HempUSA.org.
We all know that they're not telling us the truth. So stand up for your rights, demand the real medicine, and your right to use it and grow it. This is Rick Simpson, and you're listening to American Freedom Radio.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the war in the Persian Gulf. You know my favorite part of that war? It's the first war we ever had that was on every channel plus cable. We like war. We're a warlike people. We like war because we're good at it. And you know why we're good at it? Because we get a lot of practice. This country's only 200 years old, and already we've had 10 major wars. We average a major war every 20 years in this country, so we're good at it. And it's a good thing we are. We're not very good at anything else anymore. Huh? Can't build a decent car. Got no steel industry left. Can't educate our young people. Can't get health care to our old people. And you probably noticed I don't feel about that war the way we were told we were supposed to feel about that war, the way we were ordered and instructed by the United States government to feel about that war. You see, I tell you, my mind doesn't work that way. I got this real moron thing I do. It's called thinking. And I'm not a very good American because I like to form my own opinions. I don't just roll over when I'm told to. Sad to say, most Americans just roll over on command. Not me. I have certain rules I live by. My first rule, I don't believe anything the government tells me. Nothing. Zero. Nope. And I don't take very seriously the media or the press in this country, who in the case of the Persian Gulf War were nothing more than unpaid employees of the Department of Defense, and who most of the time function as kind of an unofficial public relations agency for the United States government. So I don't listen to them. I don't get all choked up about yellow ribbons and American flags. I consider them to be symbols, and I leave symbols to the symbol-minded.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow, friendships to flourish, with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
No rules, no rules, no taboo topics, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, no fear of doom. We are American Freedom Radio, American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City. Your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the second hour here at American Freedom Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and joining us is my good friend and a frequent guest on the show, Stephen Singular, of course, the author of Legacy of Deception. And if you're just joining us right now, in the first hour, we were talking with Stephen about his work on the OJ Simpson trial and some of the sort of social impacts that this has had on us as a society. And Stephen, we kind of had to cut you off there at the end. And I don't know if you wanted to finish your thought on what you were saying. Anything. I know we were talking about the ESPN documentary a little bit. Anything you wanted to finish up on that?
I just think we have to start healing some of these things as a society, as we're seeing with, again, the police violence or minorities versus police violence. I think the Simpson case was a great opportunity to look below the surface of this very visible case and learn more about it and learn why minority people in America feel the way they do and learn that the police do on occasion or sometimes do things that are very, very destructive, especially to the trust in communities. And that's really the larger issue here. And I think if we had more truth around the Simpson case and not just opinions here and opinions there and this total division, it would be useful and it would be helpful. So I think what you're doing is really a public service to get people to look a little more deeply into these events. They're not just television shows where you see lawyers arguing with one another or things of that nature. They have a direct impact on the streets of our cities and of the lives of our people. And it sounds like lofty language or something like that, but that's really the case. We haven't come to grips at all with the Simpson case, and we're still feeling the consequences of that.
No, I know. It's also you think back and you look at what happened there when you've got what seems to be, the more you look into it, multiple police officers and then others within law enforcement, such as DAs, lawyers, forensic examiners, all of these people kind of each adding on a piece of this sort of cover-up. And that's something that your source talks about in Legacy of Deception. This was a conspiracy of misconceptions, and that this wasn't an overarching grand conspiracy with everybody at the LAPD, but it's a couple. All it takes is just a few police officers to each kind of sweeten the stew a little bit to sort of push the evidence in one particular direction, knowing that once that evidence, however real or imagined it is, once that becomes, quote, fact for these cops, then the actual investigation ends. And you look at that and you look at what can happen there, and then you see the sort of trajectory of that moving into, it took all of these people and they all had to, they were planting things, they were, altering bits and pieces, and then you still get ultimately the jury finds him not guilty based on this evidence, yet obviously the court of public opinion is that he's guilty. You look at that and then you move on to, well, now it's even with a dash cam, a cop can blow some guy's head off, at a trumped up traffic stop or something like that, and get away with it. I mean, you sort of have to wonder, what's next? What's the next iteration of this? Because as you said, I mean, things have only gotten worse. I mean, there's none of this, there's no positive sort of change that's going on. Even the things like Black Lives Matter has become, very derailed, and I think they're obviously being infiltrated by all sorts of nefarious groups to kind of push them in a certain direction and to make sure, again, that they don't actually achieve the sort of change that they're really looking for. So you also have to wonder, the trickle-down effect of this is only going to become more extreme unless we actually try and confront this head on. And again, the OJ trial is such an excellent case to look at, because there is so much factual evidence. And factual evidence that Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden couldn't really argue. They kept, if you go back and you watch the old, tape recordings of this, they flip flop, they go back and forth, they change their story constantly. Their timeline differs throughout the course of the trial. It puts you in this mindset of like, dear God, what is next in all of this? I guess, Stephen, there's also the kind of, I think there's also a hesitancy with a lot of people looking into this, because it's ugly on all sides. Simpson is not an angel. Right. And I think there's the tendency with some people that look at that assume that he's completely innocent. He was all framed. They don't even want to look into the darker side of this. And again, that brings up a thread that sort of follows throughout this case, and that is drugs, and particularly cocaine, of which almost everybody surrounding OJ and his friends and their friends and their, all the way out, Goldman and so forth, they're all kind of connected to that. And I think that's also the other part, is that that's an ugly truth that the defense wasn't willing to get into. And you talk about that in your book, and you've talked about that with me, is that, again, this hesitancy to actually, for the defense to put out the truth. And right. I mean, Carl Douglas more or less said that to you, didn't he?
Well, what he said, and again, for those who may just be tuning in, Carl Douglas was Johnny Cochran's second lawyer in command, and I had presented them with all of these things that we talked about in the first hour. And at one point, he just looked at me and he said, "I don't need you. I don't need your evidence. I don't need any of this. If I get two black people on the jury, we'll acquit Simpson, and that's that. We'll win." And again, in the courtroom, for anyone who's ever spent any time there, lawyers talk constantly about the law, or the jury trial is a search for the truth. Nothing could be further from the case in this particular set of circumstances. Nobody was interested in the truth. And in terms of actually conducting an investigation that would have led somewhere. You've got to think back. Furman says that he finds the glove at 6 a.m. on Simpson's property. The tape goes up around OJ's house, and the case is over. The investigation is over. I mean, here you have two people murdered in circumstances that, I mean, if you just look at what it looks like physically, it looks like some sort of a crime associated with people who know how to use knives really, really well, and know how to kill people and keep them quiet really, really well. How does one person keep two people quiet while he's killing them with a knife? That's a question you might ponder. This looks very much, just on the surface, if you didn't know anything else, like a drug killing. But the tape goes up, and investigation is never done. Only through the diligence of certain defense investigators do we later learn that Goldman had a friend named Brett Cantor in 1993 on the nightclub scene in L.A., just like Goldman was, whose throat was slit from ear to ear 1 year earlier, unsolved crime. 1 year after Goldman is killed, another acquaintance who actually dated Kim Goldman, named Michael Nigg from Colorado, is shot to death in the parking lot of a restaurant in L.A., unsolved murder. So what are the odds of three young men all being killed violently in unsolved cases not having some connection to one another or to something larger? Never investigated, never looked into by the police. We know there were people convicted in the years leading up to this case of running West Side restaurants, which is where Mezzaluna was, West Side LA restaurants, that were used as distribution points for cocaine. We know that. That's a matter of public record. What is the connection here between all of that and this case? We don't know. It was never investigated. But there are questions that are worth asking. I think the the lead-in to this second segment, I may be wrong, but I think it was a George Carlin bit.
Yes.
About thinking for yourself. I mean, that's, if you ask yourself, if you're listening to this, say, well, what does this have anything to do with me? You know, it happened a long time ago, and I really, you know, what's the connection to me? We're all citizens of this democracy. We all have these great things given us, like freedom and a legal system that's pretty darn good, and constitutional rights and all of those things. This is a classic litmus test of being able to think for yourself. That's what George Carlin is talking about. He's funny and he's wise, and he's saying there's a necessity to be able to think for yourself about events of this nature and not just accept whatever is spoon-fed to you. And that's what this case is ultimately all about. That's the education that I got by being given some information and becoming involved in it. When I was given the information, you know, I was told, you want to stand on the sidelines and just observe things the way you always do and have no, you know, dog in the fight, or do you want to get involved in something and really see more deeply into how things work? And it was the greatest education anybody could have. If you, regardless of what you think about the case, if you read Legacy of Deception, I think you'll see that there are layers and layers to complex, huge criminal events in American society. And to just swallow whatever anybody hands you is not a useful thing for being a citizen.
No, of course, and again, you know, you I think the very first time we ever talked was just on the phone, and you mentioned to me the fact that with this case, it's, you know, and it's viewed by everybody on the planet, the most viewed and closely, you know, was under a microscope, this whole case, and yet they were still able to convince all of us that it, you know, wasn't about drugs, it wasn't about this, it was just a jealous Othello-type lover. Then yeah, it's very easy to convince anybody of any sort of event or crime that, well, no, this is the official narrative, this is the story, and you must stick to it. And you know, so much of that goes back in many ways, especially here in America, to the OJ trial. You know, because again, if they're able to convince you of this, even when he's innocent, you know, and he's proved that he's innocent, and there's all this evidence. Again, you know, I mean, that's something that I always find funnier, that people like, you know, Jeffrey Toobin and who is the Vanity Fair writer who was very close with all of that, older guy.
Dominic Dunn.
Yes, Dominic Dunn. You know, they sat in the courtroom for the whole thing. They heard all this evidence. You know, they knew. They had to have known, and yet they go on to write these so-called illustrious books, making a lot of money off of this case, essentially lying to people. And these are supposed to be legal experts. You know, Jeffrey Toobin was a lawyer, and yet they manipulate, and they're sort of more kind of open about it, you know, and that, well, that wasn't really quite true, and you know, they come up with all these sort of mental gymnastics to convince people. And I think that's even more scary, and we're moving closer and closer to that as a society, where even when we know it's a lie, when we're being spoon-fed a lie, we accept it anyway. You know, and I couldn't help but think of, you know, last night, and that I'm sure you watched the debate, or at least some of it. Yeah. But, you know, you'll see lies from both of them. You'll see Hillary Clinton lying. You'll see Donald Trump lying. You know, and all of these people will just accept it as fact. You know, it doesn't matter how ludicrous it is. It doesn't even matter when they contradict themselves in a 2-minute follow-up on a presidential debate. People are still willing to accept that. And the OJ trial, I think, kind of it illuminates that sort of thing, where again, you'd all these people every day, they were watching court TV, and then of course, once the session ended for the day, they'd flip over to CNN, to the court TV commentators, to ABC, NBC, CBS, all those things, and then just kind of and listen to these idiots who don't know anything, and then convince themselves, oh, right, yeah, even though what I saw, you know, being presented to me as evidence, you know, indisputable evidence by a police officer, let's say, like someone like Kelly Muldorfer, who I brought up on numerous times. This is a woman who was in charge of inventorying the Ford Bronco. Well, she said there was no blood inside. And you have all these people, but yet people will deny that. They'll say that that's not true. Oh, but they found it. Mark Furman saw it. So that's a really powerful thing to sort of let take hold of you. And I can't stress enough. I mean, this trial really will change your outlook on everything when you start to really kind of look into it. And again, all this stuff is there. A lot of, like you said, people listening to you talk, they might think, wow, this is crazy. I can't believe this didn't make stuff. But everything you brought to Cochran and Douglas did come out in the trial. Everything the main pieces, the EDTA, the bag, the connection between Furman and Nicole, the stick, and numerous other things that you brought up, all of those things were there. It's on the record. You can go and find it. But yet, people seemingly only want to hear OJ's guilty. Nicole and Ronald were innocent. They're angels. OJ is the devil. So Stephen, I know we're kind of running out of time, and you got to get going. But any kind of like closing thoughts? Anything? Anything on any? Are we any closer to kind of solving this? Is there any new information or anything that you kind of want to leave the listeners with before you have to get going?
We're not any closer to solving this. That seems like a real long shot at this point. I think the larger issue here is that you really do have to learn to think for yourself and to look at things a little more critically than we're encouraged to do in our society. Propaganda works on people. I don't think I understood it nearly as well before this case as I did afterward, that we are all susceptible to it. I was susceptible to it. Everybody is. And it works on you, and it works on people, and it's a very dangerous thing. And so you have to be a little bit vigilant as a member of the society about the information that you're being given. If you want to know more about this case, as Pierce is saying, you can read my book. You can read Killing Time by Donald Freed. It's an excellent book. There are other things that are out there. And maybe you can start to sort of understand the dynamics behind all of this. The people that push it usually have an agenda, and the agenda usually has to do with making a lot of money. And the people who made a great deal of money off of this particular case by writing about it or talking about it had absolutely no interest in the underlying reality of it. I mean, go back to what I said about Christopher Darden. He's telling people in his book, his New York Times best-selling book that he received millions of dollars for, that if what I was saying about the blood evidence is in fact true, then it's Brady material that should have stopped the trial. This man is what's called a sworn officer of the court. That's who he is. That's his job. He talks about a search for the truth. The FBI came in and tested the blood. The FBI found the preservative. It should have been dealt with in the course of the trial in the legal system. But everybody lined up for that or against it because it was the easy thing to do and because it would ultimately lead to him writing a book showing that he learned absolutely nothing from any of this, showing that you can put a defendant in front of the entire world and put a glove on his hand that doesn't fit and be directly responsible for that and take no responsibility for it and continue to think the way you do and to continue to believe that that does not have a consequence in the future. It does. It's playing out today in our streets. And however a listener attaches to this conversation, you're a part of it. You could be a victim of it. You could be a participant in it in some way. We're all interconnected to this. We're all a part of these racial dynamics and this law and order drama that plays out in the United States every single day. And so you can take the easy road like Darden did and just say, I'm going to deny reality and the heck with it. Or you can try to learn something more about the society you're living in. And if you're the kind of person who wants to do that, if you want to be like George Carlin, the great comedian, and think for yourself and be your own person and not just follow the herd, then put a little effort into it. Pierce is doing a great thing here by offering someone like me an alternative platform to talk on. The major media doesn't want to hear this, doesn't want anything to do with this, and they haven't for 22 years. And then they sit around and wring their hands day after day on national television and radio and say, why are all these racial things happening? My, oh my, why is that going on in the streets of America? Maybe, just maybe, you're a participant in that in some way. Maybe by perpetuating things that are untrue, that are based solely on opinion, and not taking the trouble to learn anything about it, maybe you're participating and adding to that racial confusion, that racial anger, that racial trouble. Think about it from that point of view for one moment. Maybe I'm a part of this somehow. Maybe I have some obligation to think for myself and to learn a little bit more and to not condemn people just because somebody tells me to. We all profess to believe in the high ideals of America. We're the greatest country in the world, and we have all these beliefs. Get involved in something. Do what I did. Get off the sidelines. Learn a little bit more about it. Take a risk. Do something different. Do something against what other people are telling you to do. If it's not this issue, make it some other issue. Don't be passive. Don't take your opinions from people who are paid to foment prejudice. Don't do it. That's my message to you. You don't have to believe what I wrote or what's in my book or anything else. Do it for yourself. You'll have a journey just like Pierce is having when he calls me up. He learned something. I learned something. The best thing that can happen is that young people like him coming up will look back over their shoulder and say, what really happened there? I want to know more about it. And why does it keep happening in my society? Why do these kids keep getting shot? Why is there all this anger and racial division and hatred? What could I do about it? Well, maybe the first thing you could do is just not accept everything you're told. And that's my ending message, on the subject matter, because I stand as Exhibit 1. I thought a certain way, I got involved, and my thinking started to change. And I'm the direct beneficiary of doing that. I learned more about why minority people think and feel the way they do, their vulnerability in these circumstances than I ever knew before. And I thought I knew something about that. But my education started right there, and maybe yours can too.
Excellent sort of message, I think, for everybody out there. And again, just to, we really have to understand this at a deeper level beyond, they just don't like the police, or, the police are just doing their job. There's a lot more to all of that. And, I just encourage what you were just saying there. Quickly, Stephen, where can people go to get the new updated edition of Legacy of Deception? And also, you have a new updated edition of Presumed Guilty, which is about the John Benet Ramsey. Where can people go to get that?
Both of them are on Kindle, Amazon. They're available now. And, I would encourage people, again, these cases are all about learning to think for yourself, learning to go below the surface. And be a participant and not just a passive observer of these things.
Excellent. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me. I know you have a busy schedule right now, and hopefully we'll get you back on the show again soon to talk more OJ. I'd love to talk about the John Benet Ramsey case when we get closer to the anniversary of that, which would this year it'll be the 20th anniversary in late December. But I know you've got to get running, so I'll let you go. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Pierce. It was very good. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that was, of course, Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, an investigation of Mark Furman and racism in the LAPD. And I hope everybody got something out of there. I know, the beginning, I think a lot of people that are familiar with the work that I've done with Stephen have probably heard the kind of the sort of opening 30 minutes or so where Stephen kind of lays it out. But it is important because I know we've got a lot of new listeners here over at AFR and on all the other stations that I'm broadcast on. We've got new listeners joining all the time, and I think it's always important to kind of reiterate the OJ Simpson trial and what actually went on during the murder and then during the trial, of course, because it's good to to get down a good 30-minute presentation. If you ever do have a friend out there who's thinks you're crazy or ludicrous for believing this, of course, I think it unfortunately in the world we live in, you do kind of need like a soundbite answer, and I think Stephen's 30-minute answer is always very beneficial. And again, anyone that is interested in the stuff that Stephen has covered and the stuff that the two of I have talked about, we've got a bunch. I want to say 3 very long episodes dealing with Legacy of Deception, dealing with the updated edition of Legacy, dealing with all sorts of little tiny there's so many bits and pieces to this case. Even in the 3 episodes that we've done, we've just barely scratched the surface. We mostly focused on, again, this EDTA, which anyone out there who has seen the Netflix series Making of a Murderer, they'll be somewhat familiar with EDTA because I know that played a role in that case. And it's funny because I remember when that came out, a lot of friends talking about it, and they're all talking about EDTA, and I mentioned, oh well, that's what essentially proved that OJ was innocent, and they're just sort of look at you shocked, and they can't believe that, and no way, and that's an interesting kind of dynamic that I think is sort of a result of the OJ trial, is that, and I don't want to point fingers and make this all about race, because I think, as Stephen has pointed out in some of our other conversations, this case wasn't entirely about race. It certainly played an enormous factor, with OJ being black, with Furman being a racist, with the all-white jury of the civil trial finding him guilty, whereas a predominantly black jury, not entirely, but predominantly black jury in the criminal trial finding him innocent. Obviously, race is a factor in all of that, but I found it interesting with the Making of a Murderer and the Avery case. They can believe that. They can believe that a poor white guy would get framed by the, big bad evil police, but not a rich black guy. That would never happen. And I'll state right now, I'm not really, I lean more towards the opinion that Avery probably did do it. And I think that's one of those sort of examples with crime cases where it's not about it's never about proving who did kill the woman that I can't remember her name off the top of my head that Avery is accused of. It's never about solving that crime. It's just about proving it couldn't have been him, and then it becomes a sort of guessing game. And I know that's sort of that's become the mode of operation for like the West Memphis 3, where it's never really about, well, who did murder those 3 little boys. It's well, it had to be this guy. Or, oh no, it's not. It can't be him. Oh, it's this stepfather. Well, no, it's actually that stepfather. Oh no, it's the I forget there's another character that they always point to in the West Memphis 3, the sort of like drifter character at the restaurant. Oh, it had to be him. It's not actually about looking into who did this, and that is something that I've been more and more interested in as I sort of unraveled what the OJ trial was. Is first you kind of have to set up the idea of, well, OJ didn't do it, right? Or let's look at the evidence that sort of disproves that theory. And as I said, it's all kind of right there in front of you. Once you get that into your mind, then obviously the next logical step is, well, okay, then who did do it? And you start looking at the fact that you've got Dr. Golden, the original coroner, saying that 2 knives were used. And then you think about the idea, well, how did nobody hear anything? Nicole Simpson was almost decapitated. That's not something you just easily do without, any noise. All of the sort of the dogs barking, which seems to be, this is like one of the only cases I can think of, prominent cases, where, most of the eyewitnesses were dogs. That's how so much of the prosecution's timeline is dictated by when certain dogs were barking. And there's all sorts of even issues with the dogs themselves, and there's Nicole's dog, and there's a lot of issues about the officer in question who knew Mark Fuhrman quite well, who was playing with the dog, and then he also went over from Bundy to Rockingham to OJ's property, and could he have possibly, cross-contamination? Again, in any other trial, that would have been front and center. But in OJ, that doesn't become the case. And that is sort of where I'm at in terms of researching OJ is who could be responsible for this? Because that's as I said, race is a very important factor in this, and of course the way that law enforcement and the criminal justice system works. But the third component to all of this, which is very connected to the previous two, race and criminal justice, is of course drugs. And the drug angle is always in anything, any kind of deep state event or political corruption or anything like that. Drugs is always the kind of off limits. That's always the taboo topic. That can never really be explained properly. And you can look at things like, Iran-Contra. There's never been, I guess until sort of recently with Kill the Messenger, which is about Gary Webb, there's never really been a Hollywood film diving into this. And in fact, there's a film, I can't remember off the top of my head, that Sigourney Weaver was attached to. And this is back, I think, in the early 90s. And they wanted to, it's about military people, and Sigourney Weaver plays a soldier or something. And they wanted access to, I think it was an aircraft carrier or some fighter jets. So they approached the Pentagon about this. And the Pentagon said, well, only if you take out, all of this stuff dealing with Iran-Contra, because in the script, the original script, they're very critical of what went on. And ultimately, that movie never got made. So, and again, too, you can have John Kerry, back in the 80s, saying all these things. Oh, yeah, of course, the CIA knowingly was shipping cocaine in, and we were, and guns, and the Iranians were involved, and, Oliver North, and Freeway Ricky Ross, and all of these people, he'll admit that then. But now, if you were to ask him about, was the CIA still doing this? He would probably say, well, they never did it in the first place. Again, that sort of, lying, even though he knows the truth. So, drugs are always a very touchy subject, and one that people don't want to get into, because of course it leads to some very nefarious characters, and it leads into a whole underworld that is quite dangerous. And again, if you take the time and you really kind of look into the OJ trial, you look into some of the researchers, some of the books that have been put out, and some of the various theories, anytime you get into drugs and stuff like that, nobody wants to talk about it. And that's what's so interesting. Again, looking back 21 years, the defense did float that idea very briefly for one day during the trial. People will remember the whole Colombian necktie. And I think it's Johnny Cochran who kind of brought that up. And he sort of, he posits, was that, could that have been a drug hit, Colombian necktie? And then suddenly that just disappears, as if, Cochran never said it. It's never brought up again. I know that when Stephen was looking into it, he did a bunch of research looking into the Aspen connection. And Aspen, of course, being in Colorado, it's a very rich, it's like I guess you could say it's like the Los Angeles or the Hollywood of Colorado. And OJ and his family, of course, spent a lot of time there, including at least once with Donald Trump. But and there is a big drug connection to Aspen. There's a lot of cocaine that goes in and out of there. Mezzaluna Restaurant, for instance, which is the place where Goldman worked, where Nicole, Faye Resnick, and all of her friends used to frequent. There's also a Mezzaluna in Colorado, in Aspen. And when Stephen started looking into that, suddenly nobody wanted to talk to him. Sources that he had, that were reliable said, we're not getting into that. We don't want to touch that. There were other people. There was private investigator Barry Holster, I think it's Holster, who did some work for the defense. He told the Star, the tabloid, that, through his sort of work, that Nicole and her friends, quote, were over their heads with some dope dealers. So the defense certainly knew about this, and then you kind of have to wonder, well, why didn't they pursue this? Who was pressuring them not to? And I would assume it had to have been OJ himself, who I think, again, kind of playing the devil's advocate here, there is this like unhealthy trend in a lot of the OJ researchers to not look into that angle, to assume that OJ is an angel, or simply the people that believe he's framed would never think of him as being connected with drugs or anything like that. But of course, I mean, OJ's connection to organized drug trafficking goes all the way back to his days in Buffalo when he played for the Bills. And just after the murders, I believe, just after the murders on the June 26th, a very good friend or an acquaintance of OJ's, Casimir Butch Chikarsky, was murdered down in Florida along with two other women. Now, he was originally a Buffalo native, moved to Florida in the 1980s. He was, sort of like a playboy type character. But Chikarsky was once caught in a major drug sting in Buffalo aimed at OJ Simpson. And again, you can go back and there's a whole criminal case, the Buffalo PD. In the 70s, they were conducting a bunch of drug cases, and one of them was aimed at OJ. And it was believed by the Buffalo police that OJ himself was involved in coke trafficking and that he was supplying cocaine to a lot of prominent people in the NFL and other kind of celebrities and the rich and powerful in Buffalo. And this is all, again, in the Buffalo News, all kind of out there. And OJ knew a lot of these people. And again, too, you'd think, a few days after Nicole and Ronald are murdered, then a close friend of OJ's is killed, who was once caught in a large-scale police raid targeted against him. Why is that not investigated? And again, I've mentioned the whole Joey Ippolito, who was a big organized crime figure, a big drug trafficker he started shipping weed, I think from Mexico through the Caribbean into Florida, of course, and then moved on to cocaine. And of course, he was very connected to OJ Simpson. Al Cowlings, AC, who was the driver in the Bronco, of course, was a bodyguard of Ippolito. Nicole's sister Denise dated one of Ippolito's hitmen, who was nicknamed the Animal. Stephen mentioned before Michael Nigg, of course, who was brutally murdered in what was called a robbery where nothing was stolen. And Michael Nigg was, again, known at Mezzaluna. Michael Nigg had connections to Aspen as well and drugs there. Michael Nigg also dated Ronald Goldman's sister. So, again, they're all these people are very interconnected. But the drug angle is one that it just is sort of off limits. And I know I mentioned that before, and I'll say now, next week we're going to have Ed Opperman and Brian Heiss on the show, and we're going to do a whole big another OJ episode, because I think it's important. Now we have 21 years since the trial ending, and essentially all of the same stories and narratives are still out there. It's still OJ is evil and guilty, and because he's a wife beater, that means he would also murder his wife while his children are home, and Goldman as well. So I think it's important to take a step back, to revisit this case. Again, as Stephen said, all of these issues that we're seeing, the sort of widespread violence and the reprisals too. I see a lot of people in the alternative media, and stuff just going on and on about, these riots and, they're so terrible and we need law and order. That was Trump's big, one of his, phrases that he kept using, yesterday, where he's talking about a nationwide stop and frisk, which is beyond insane. That would allow the police anywhere to do whatever they want. And I'll say this right now, living in New York, you don't want that. You don't want to, I myself, luckily have never, been stopped and frisked, but a lot of my friends have, my roommates have both been, stopped and frisked. It's not something that you'd want. And again, in New York, that just sort of became, that was in effect essentially even before, it was really introduced as like a widespread thing, with 9/11, of course. You can't every day, bus, train, even in taxis, you hear the automated announcement that, all bags are subject to random search by police officers. And this is all a legacy of, 9/11. So, do we really want that nationwide? But anyway, moving away from that, as I was saying, this is really kind of permeating out. There's a lot more at stake in terms of our freedoms here. And again, as I said, there's a lot of people in the alternative media that just kind of dismiss all of these, mostly black individuals here that are pissed off at this. They think that they either think that this is like some sort of plot by George Soros to, sow a race war. Not that he's not involved on some level. Yeah. I of course, I'm sure he's funding, Black Lives Matters. I'm sure he puts money into all sorts of things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that doesn't mean that what they're ultimately standing for isn't true. If anything, he just wants to, if anything, he doesn't want that to happen. He doesn't want, this sort of race war. He wants to be able to control this. He wants to maintain that they will essentially be, good little puppets of his that he can roll out if he ever needs to, but so that they can control these groups. That's something that I find people are missing. And I think, again, a lot of this is the legacy of what happened back in the mid-90s. The lasting effects of what happened to OJ Simpson, we're still feeling it. And in many instances, we're not even aware of it. We have these, sort of thoughts have been programmed into us ahead of time. And the OJ trial in many ways was a sort of ultimate reprogramming of people. And also you look back to that whole, time period, and you had the LA riots, you had a lot of, Rodney King, Amadou Diallo here in New York. That was shortly thereafter. A lot of these sort of instances happened, and that was sort of the first wave of that. I think people had been aware of police violence, but not in this sort of in-your-face way. Again, you look at Rodney King. That's all on tape. There's no kind of denying that. And of course, Mark Furman was implicated in. He was named, at least in the official report that came out on Rodney King. So all of these sort of factors that were going on in that area, there could have been this sort of moment of reflection, this moment of, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into this. What else is really going? How is this affecting us? How is this going to affect us years from now? And instead, we allowed for a media that was, again, also burgeoning, cable media, talking head pundits, all of these people, the rise of Greta Van Susteren, of course, and Geraldo all came out of the OJ trial. And again, this sort of fascination with celebrity crime, and not really caring about the crime, but caring about the perceptions of the crime, caring about the emotions of the crime. And we've been lulled into this sort of mindset where these external things going on are almost insignificant to us. They don't really matter in the way that they should. And, as Stephen was sort of saying there before he left, it's, why are they so upset? How is race a problem here in America? And, you listen like last night to our two illustrious candidates. And, what is Clinton offering? We just need better, community policing and better, relationship with the religious groups and that'll and we got to get the guns out of here. All the guns have got to go. Does that count the policemen? Probably not. And then, on the opposite end, it's just Trump basically saying we need more police, more stop and frisk. And ultimately, his response, of course, is that, well, it's really the blacks, and the Hispanics. It's their problem. And we, as the, white elite, we need to teach them how to be better. We need to police them better. That's really what he's saying, in his, during the debate. And a lot of these mindsets have in many ways been predisposed to us. We've been conditioned all these 21 years since the end of the trial to fit into that particular narrative. And that narrative is only getting worse and worse. And, ultimately, I don't know where we're headed with that sort of a trajectory. I don't see any kind of solution in sight. And again, there's a variety of reasons why that is the case. Whatever the left or the, like Black Lives Matter or any of that, the sort of people against this, well, they've already been co-opted. They're already being infiltrated. They're already being controlled. They're being put into a box where they won't matter, where, and they've got agent provocateurs in there that are definitely pushing certain people into a direction, with the, sort of a destruction of private property and things like that. And then on the other side, of course, is just, well, we need more police. We need more draconian laws. We need more sort of like clamp down on all of this. Not looking at, is this becoming a systemic problem? And again, too, a problem that is it already has trickled down. Obviously, there's numerous cases of cops killing white people all the time. It's like every week there's like a story of, SWAT teams busting into some old guy's home, thinking it's a meth lab or something. They've got the wrong address and they gun him down. They always killed his dog also. They always use, it's interesting. They always use the dog as that's like the weapon, the dog was barking. So we, put two in the dog's head and then put two in the old man's head. So all these things are sort of, they're already there. They're already happening, but we've become so complacent as a society here that we're just unwilling to look any deeper than, it's almost like, well, this is just reality, like these past 21 years up in, where we are right now. This is just reality. This is just how it is. And we can kind of argue back and forth about these little things, we need better community work between the community and the police, or we need more police. And ultimately, both sides of those are the same thing. What they really want is just, they want more policing. They want, and they want people to be more accepting of that. Like that's what Hillary Clinton is saying when she talks about, building relationships. It's really, you need to stop stepping out of line. Okay. So you need to, we don't want you marching in the streets. No. Instead, you should, petition your, corrupt local politician who's, getting paid off by the police, the policemen's union, and that's what's funding his campaign. And you got to petition that guy so that then he can go and speak at your city council and make some, idiotic speech, and then just get back to your lives. Get back to just start watching all of your, DOD, CIA funded media, and just kind of live your life out like that. That's what they want. And again, the roots of all of this. 21 years ago, where we had this moment, this sort of in time where, again, the most publicized trial. Every day you could watch this on TV in real time. And then, of course, they replayed it later that night. You could have had a lot of people begin to wake up to the reality that we're living in, where, again, a man, and I think OJ is a great example of this too, because this is a guy who moved in white society. You know, that was always like Darden and Clark's, that was their sort of bomb that they would hurl at him is, oh, he's not even really a black man, and we hear that a lot. It's, like I hear, people say that like with Obama, well, and he's not really black. It's well, yeah, he is actually, but and they use that with OJ. He's this guy who runs in white society, and then like that, just stopping on a dime, suddenly he is the worst of Black America, embodied in this one man, this one moment in time. He becomes everybody's sort of projected image of the evil black man who wants to kill his white wife. And suddenly that becomes ingrained in all of us. And like I said, we see that time and time again, especially too with the cases that we do hear about in the media. Anytime it's like a black kid or a black guy gets killed, the only time that it ever makes Fox News, MSNBC, the New York Times, any of those things, there's always the caveat of, well, he did sell drugs once before, and, well, he did get into a lot of fights at school, and, well, technically he, charged the officer. People said that with Eric Garner out in Staten Island. Well, he should have never said, this ends today, as if that was some sort of statement that he's going to, butcher these cops. Again, this is a man that had been routinely harassed by some of those cops personally, including this, getting strip searched and rectally examined in public. So yeah, he did say, this ends today. I'm not going to stand for it. And then on camera in front of dozens of people, they murder him, and yet we don't care. It's irrelevant. Doesn't matter. And if anything, we hear a lot of, people, even in the alternative media, more or less excusing it, kind of siding with the police, siding with law and order. We can't have these, uppity black guys, going around and, expressing their opinions, standing up for themselves. They should fall into line. And I, again, bring about with the debates in this election, that's what both of the candidates are saying. Both of them want all of these people to shut up and to get back in line and to just follow the sort of normal way of life that has been crafted over, hundreds of years here in America. That's what they're both asking for, with varying degrees, with Clinton kind of seemingly nicer about it, of course, signing these crime bills and stuff. And then Trump with being more sort of upfront and nasty, we need more cops. But all they really want is for all of us to shut up and to follow, orders, to use a bad phrase. And we need to kind of grow past that if we're ever going to, to defeat the New World Order or to just sort of regain our own independence over these people. We need to explore things like the OJ Simpson trial, because was this sort of major catalyst that could form so much of this and could reshape our opinions on all sorts of crimes, and we won't have these kind of knee-jerk, he's guilty, he's innocent. That's it. That's the end of the story. There's nothing else to this. All these extenuating circumstances, they don't really matter, because in my heart of hearts, I know he has to be guilty. Well, anyway, thank you for tuning in to this episode. As I said, I will be back next week with Ed Opperman and Brian Heiss for more on the anniversary of the OJ Simpson trial. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
News and information you can trust. This is American Freedom Radio. Freedom, American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio.